I'm Nick, and this is my author discussion on Alain Locke and his work on the New Negro. So Alain Locke was a prominent philosopher and author during the post-Reconstruction era after the Civil War. He was born in Pennsylvania, and his mother was an educator. Um, he was an extreme academic even in his youth. He ended up studying at Harvard University for philosophy and literature. He did a lot of his work teaching at Howard University, which is historically African American. He went back to Harvard to earn his doctorate in philosophy, and he was the first African American awarded the Rhodes Scholar, which is given by Oxford University. But he kind of experienced a lot of racism because a lot of the colleges denied him work because of his race. He's most well known of being the father of the Harlem Renaissance because of a lot of his work and ideas motivated the movement, including the New Negro, which we'll talk about. So the New Negro, published in 1925, was a essay and analysis of African American culture, and in the essay, it's a collection of work done by African American artists, including poets, musicians, authors. Examples are like Langston Hughes and Langston Hughes' poems, which we've done work in this class for. The New Negro was kind of what defined the Harlem Renaissance movement. The Harlem Renaissance movement was also known as the New Negro movement because a lot of the things Locke argues for is kind of what the Harlem Renaissance was, its purpose. And that was Locke wanted the African American people to kind of reinvent and reestablish a new cultural identity and kind of break from the image they had of, especially after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. So even though the 13th Amendment kind of freed a lot of African Americans and abolished slavery, they were not free in terms of economically, politically, socially, or culturally, and they kind of were lost in that aspect of life. Locke talks a lot about, and he compares the old Negro versus the new Negro, and how the old Negro was kind of living in the shadow of the of slavery, and how people of color were not seen as equal. And he talks about how they were talked about as like a formula versus actual human beings, where they were kept down or worried about and didn't really have that independence that Locke wanted for the African American population. And then he wants the new Negro to be self-aware and wants them to have a desire for kind of, he describes it as spiritual emancipation. Where they kind of have self-respect and self-pride in their heritage and their race. So some textual analysis. Um, uh, this was released in 1925, so this was kind of post World War One, which kind of created a lost generation. Is the Roaring Twenties, where there's a lot of cultural shifts, not just in African American communities, but all across America. And the post Reconstruction period, kind of trying to recover or help um, after the abolishment of slavery. You know, there was a lot of African Americans that were kind of lost, and even though they abolished slavery, it doesn't solve all the problems. He talks a lot about the Great Migration, especially from southern states to northern states, and more specifically, um, urban areas like Harlem in New York City. And he says it was a great opportunity for a lot of the different aspects of African American culture to come together, where even though they were different, they were kind of sympathetic to the struggles they had in common. And it was a mix of, it was really diverse, where he says there's businessmen, um, poor and rich, there were poets, authors, writers, just a lot of aspects of the culture. And also during the time, it was the age of jazz, and African American culture was having uh, an impact um, during the time. And it showed how it was kind of an example of um, how African American artists were aware and being self-expressive to who they were, and not just um, what I guess um, white people expected them to be. But he wanted this not just he wanted this overall, just not in music or other things. Um, so some themes that kind of reside in the New Negro is obviously talk about equality and racism. And during the time, there was a lot of racial tension, especially an example for with the KKK. And it wasn't common for African American individuals. It wasn't common for individuals to think as African American people to be less than or not as good as people of non-color, including African Americans. So it was important for um, Locke thought it was important for them to not think that as well. And he talks about not being compliant with what they were expected to be or what role they should play in society. They should just be true to who they were and what their culture was. Um, and this another big theme was identity and how it was changing, how Locke wanted it to be for the African American people, and he wanted his people to be um, self-aware and be prideful of their heritage and be free in their expression. Um, he didn't want them to be afraid of what other people thought, because that's what really was the Harlem Renaissance movement was, where it was a bunch of different mediums of expression kind of coming to play, whether it was music, um, art, writing, or whatever it was. And he talks a lot about, even though he talks a lot about like America's image on what the new Negro was gonna be, and it was really important for them, for not only America as a whole, but more importantly, as African American people saw themselves as they could be as good and better than white people. They were equal and just as capable um, of doing things they wanted to. And that's my presentation. Here's the works cited. Thanks.